Hello, my friends. Welcome to another night of Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host, also from Warm Pages. Before we begin, is there a place from your past, a town, a street, a little shop, that you still think about fondly? Share a memory with us in the comments. I treasure reading them, and don't forget to subscribe. Now relax, our story is ready to unfold. Chapter 1, Snow, Song, and a Sudden Silence. The village of Lochdub lay blanketed in snow, looking for all the world like a Christmas card that had tumbled out of some elderly aunt's bureau drawer. Police Sergeant Hamish Macbeth surveyed the scene from the window of the police station with a mixture of contentment and mild dread. Contentment because the snow had brought with it a blessed peace, keeping the villagers indoors and the crime rate at its usual level of non-existent. Dread because tonight was the annual Christmas Sally, and Hamish had learned long ago that any gathering of Lochdub's residents was a potential powder keg of gossip, feuds, and social disaster. His dog Lugs, a hound of indeterminate breed with ears that appeared to have been borrowed from a much larger animal, raised his head from the hearth and whined softly. "Aye, I know," Hamish said, running a hand through his flaming red hair. "We'll have to make an appearance. Can't have the local constable hiding from his own village, can we?" Lugs's expression suggested that this was precisely what they should do, but Hamish was already reaching for his uniform jacket. Detective Chief Inspector Blair would dearly love to hear that Hamish had shirked his community duties. The man was forever trying to prove that Hamish was too lazy and insubordinate for his post, conveniently ignoring the fact that Hamish solved more cases than any constable had a right to, and kept Lochdub running as smoothly as a well-oiled clock. The truth was, Hamish had no desire for promotion. He loved his life in Lochdub, loved the peace of the highlands, the glittering lochs, and the mountains that rose like ancient guardians around the village. Even the villagers, trying as they could be, were his villagers. They belonged to him and he to them, in that peculiar way of small places. By 7 o'clock, the village hall was ablaze with fairy lights that twinkled like fallen stars against the dark December evening. Someone had strung tinsel with more enthusiasm than artistry, and the result was a sort of metallic explosion across the ceiling. Tables groaned under the weight of traditional Scottish fare, stovies, bridies, clooty dumpling, and enough shortbread to supply a battalion. Hamish stationed himself near the back, hoping to maintain a low profile. This hope lasted approximately 4 minutes before the Curry twins descended upon him. "Hamish!" Nessie Curry shrilled, her voice cutting through the preliminary scraping of fiddles. "You'll never guess who's sponsoring the whole event!" "Who's sponsoring the whole event?" her sister Jessie echoed, as was her habit. "I imagine you're about to tell me," Hamish said with resignation. "Alistair McKinnon," Nessie announced, her eyes bright with the particular gleam that came from being first with news. "Him that bought the old distillery house, came up from Glasgow with more money than sense, and he's paying for everything tonight. Everything. The food, the drink, even hired the band special from Strathbane." "From Strathbane," Jessie confirmed. Hamish had heard of Alistair McKinnon. Everyone in Lochdub had heard of Alistair McKinnon, largely because the man made sure of it. He had arrived 3 months prior, full of plans to revitalise the village, which seemed to involve tearing down anything old and replacing it with something expensive and modern. The locals had taken to him the way a Highland cow takes to a sheepdog, which is to say, not at all. As if summoned by thought alone, a large man with a florid face and a voice like a foghorn appeared at the front of the hall. Alistair McKinnon was dressed in what he clearly believed was Highland formal wear, but which looked more like he had robbed a fancy dress shop. His kilt was too new, his sporran too ornate, and his jacket bristled with silver buttons that caught the fairy lights and threw them back in defiant sparkles. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, and the hall fell into a silence that was more wary than respectful. "I'm delighted to sponsor this wonderful Christmas Sealy for my new community." "New is rutted," muttered Archie McLean, the local fisherman, who was standing near Hamish. "Man's been here 5 minutes and thinks he owns the place." "I know many of you have been resistant to change," Alistair continued, oblivious or indifferent to the cooling temperature in the room. but I promise you my plans for Lochdubb will bring prosperity and progress. Tonight, let's celebrate the old while we prepare for the new." The applause was thin and scattered. Hamish noticed several people exchanging dark looks. He recognised Morven MacLeod, whose family had farmed land near the distillery for generations, staring at Alistair with barely concealed hostility. Near the refreshment table, a cheerful-looking woman with auburn hair was arranging glasses of mulled wine with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. She caught Hamish's eye and smiled brightly. "That's Ely Fraser," Nessie Arakari whispered, appearing at his elbow again like a tartan-clad ghost. "Moved here in September. Ever so helpful with village events. Ever so helpful. The church social, the harvest supper, and now this. Don't know what we'd do without her." "Without her," Jessie agreed. The band struck up a reel, and the dancing began in earnest. Hamish allowed himself to be pulled into a set by the postmistress, who danced with the grim determination of someone performing a civic duty. He lost track of Alistair McKinnon in the swirl of tartan and tweed, the stamp of feet on wooden boards, and the soaring cry of the fiddles. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the music suddenly stopped mid-phrase. The silence was so abrupt that it felt like a physical blow. Hamish turned to see the crowd parting near the refreshment table, people stumbling back with their hands to their mouths. Alistair McKinnon lay sprawled on the floor, his face purple, his eyes staring at nothing. A glass of mulled wine had rolled from his hands and was spreading a dark stain across the boards, like spilled blood in the festive light. Hamish was moving before his conscious mind caught up, his police training overriding everything else. He pushed through the gathering crowd, aware of Ely Fraser, kneeling beside the body, her face pale but composed. "I think he's dead," she said quietly, looking up at Hamish. "I tried to help, but I think he's dead." Dr. Jennifer Dalrymple appeared from somewhere in the crowd, her medical bag already in hand. She knelt beside Alistair, checked his pulse, and his pupils placed her ear to his chest. After a long moment, she looked up and shook her head. "He's gone," she said simply. The hall erupted in gasps and cries. The fairy lights continued to twinkle merrily, the tinsel glittered overhead, and the smell of mulled wine and pine filled the air. But the Christmas silly was over, and Hamish Macbeth's peaceful Highland winter had just become considerably more complicated. He looked down at Alistair McKinnon's body and sighed. So much for a quiet Christmas in Lochdubb. Chapter 2. A death too public to ignore. The transformation of the village hall from festive gathering place to crime scene happened with the sort of efficiency that only shock can produce. The band had packed away their instruments in silence, the dancers had retreated to the walls, and the fairy lights now seemed to cast an accusatory glare rather than a welcoming glow. Hamish had called for backup from Strathbane, though he knew it would be at least an hour before anyone arrived in the snow. In the meantime, he did what he could to preserve the scene, and keep the villagers from trampling evidence or, more likely, embellishing the facts into something that would be repeated in exaggerated whispers for years to come. "Nobody leaves," he announced, his Highland accent thickening as it always did when he was exercising authority. "I'll need statements from everyone who was near the refreshment table between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. "Everyone was near the refreshment table," someone called out. "It's a Seeley, not a temperance meeting." A nervous titter ran through the crowd, quickly stifled. Dr. Dalrymple was still examining the body, her movements methodical and professional. She was a practical woman in her 50s, new to Lochdubb, but already proving herself far more competent than her predecessor, who had possessed the unfortunate habit of diagnosing every ailment as either scurvy or the vapours. "Well?" Hamish asked quietly, crouching beside her. "I'd stake my reputation on poison," she said, keeping her voice low. "The facial discoloration, the rapidity of onset, the dilated pupils. But I'll need to wait for the post-mortem to be certain. Could be any number of substances." "How long?" "Minutes. 10 at the most from ingestion to death, I'd say. Quick at least. He wouldn't have suffered long." Small, Mercies, Hamish thought, though he wasn't sure Alistair McKinnon deserved much mercy. The man had made himself thoroughly unpopular in his short time in Loch-Dubh, throwing his money around like confetti, while simultaneously looking down his nose at the very traditions he claimed to be celebrating. "Did anyone see him eat or drink anything specific?" Hamish called out to the assembled villagers. There was a general murmur and shaking of heads. People had been dancing, talking, eating from the buffet. Who paid attention to one man's glass at a crowded party? "I saw him with the mulled wine," a clear voice said. Ayla Fraser stepped forward, her auburn hair slightly dishevelled but her manner calm. He'd been drinking it all evening. Complained it wasn't spiced enough, then complained it was too sweet. Typical of the man, if you'll forgive me saying so. "And you are?" "Ayla Fraser. I was helping to serve tonight." She gestured to the refreshment table with its ranks of glasses, some still full, others empty or half drunk. "I've been volunteering at village events since I moved here in September." Hamish studied her. She was in her early 30s, he guessed, with an open face and steady grey eyes. There was something about her competence that reminded him of a schoolteacher or a nurse, someone used to managing chaos with quiet authority. "You were at the table when he collapsed?" "Just after, actually. I'd gone to fetch more shortbread from the kitchen. When I came back, people were screaming." She paused, then added, "I barely knew the man, Sergeant. We'd spoken perhaps twice. He seemed to enjoy playing the grand benefactor, but I don't think his heart was in it. More about the image, if you know what I mean." Hamish knew exactly what she meant. He'd met plenty of Alistair McKinnons in his time, men who bought their way into communities and expected gratitude in return. The Curry twins had attached themselves to a group near the door and were holding forth in loud whispers that carried across the hall. "Poison," Nessie was saying, her eyes gleaming. "Who'd have thought we'd have a poisoning right here in Loch-Dubh?" "Right here in Loch-Dubh," Jessie echoed with ghoulish enthusiasm. "Ladies," Hamish said firmly, "this is not the time for speculation. I'll be needing to speak with each of you individually." The twins looked deflated, but they subsided into silence, or what passed for silence where they were concerned. Over the next hour, Hamish interviewed villagers one by one in the small kitchen at the back of the hall. Most had little to offer beyond complaints about Alistair's behaviour. He'd been loud, he'd been boastful, he'd monopolised conversations and made pronouncements about the village's future as if he were the laird himself. Archie McLean, smelling of fish and whiskey in equal measure, was more forthcoming than most. "The man was a menace," he said bluntly. "Wanted to turn the old distillery into luxury holiday lets. Luxury in Loch-Dubh. Who's going to come all the way up here to stay in some fancy apartment when they could be down in Edinburgh or over in Skye?" "Did you argue with him about it?" Archie shifted in his seat. "I may have mentioned that he was talking rot, and he may have mentioned that I should mind my own business unless I wanted certain irregularities with the Fishing Council brought to light." "What irregularities?" "Nothing that amounts to anything," Archie said quickly. "Ancient history. Records from 20 years ago when we weren't as strict about quotas. But the way he said it, you'd think I was running a smuggling operation." Hamish made a note. Blackmail or the threat of it was an excellent motive for murder. But would Archie McLean have the nerve to poison someone at a public event? The man could barely operate a mobile phone without swearing. Morven MacLeod was next, a sturdy woman in her 40s who farmed sheep on land that had been in her family for generations. "I won't lie to you, Hamish," she said, using his first name as everyone in Loch-Dubh did. "I hated the man. He wanted to buy my land, said it was underutilised. Underutilised? My family's been farming that land since before the clearances. But I didn't kill him. I've got better things to do than commit murder." "Where were you when he collapsed?" "On the dance floor. You can ask anyone. I was doing Strip the Willow with Angus Morrison, and I didn't leave until the music stopped." Hamish believed her. Morven MacLeod was many things, but she wasn't a liar. By the time the Strathbane contingent arrived, led by the perpetually suspicious Detective Chief Inspector Blair, Hamish had collected a folder full of statements and a headache that felt like a skiandu behind his eyes. Blair stumped into the hall, his face red from the cold and possibly from the hip flask Hamish knew he kept in his coat pocket. "Macbeth," he barked. "What have you got for me?" "A dead man, a hall full of witnesses who saw nothing, and what looks like a poisoning," Hamish replied evenly. Blair's eyes lit up with the particular malice he reserved for cases that might make Hamish look incompetent. "Poisoning? On your patch? Well, well, can't keep the peace even during the Christmas festivities, can you?" "The man was from Glasgow," Hamish said. "Likely brought his enemies with him." "Or made new ones here," Blair said, looking around the hall with barely concealed satisfaction. "These wee villages are hotbeds of resentment, in my experience. All smiles on the surface, murder underneath." Hamish didn't bother to argue. Blair would believe what he wanted to believe. Dr. Dalrymple had finished her preliminary examination and was packing away her equipment. "The body can be transported," she told Blair. "I'll do the post-mortem first thing tomorrow, but I'm confident we're looking at poisoning. The question is what kind and how it was administered." Blair turned to Hamish. "Right then, you'll get me a list of everyone who was here tonight. Statements from anyone who had contact with the deceased and a full account of his movements. I want it on my desk by morning." It was going to be a long night. As the body was removed and the villagers finally allowed to leave, Hamish found himself standing alone in the empty hall. The fairy lights had been switched off and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. He thought about Alistair McKinnon, who had come to Lockdub seeking something, a fresh start perhaps, and had found only death. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, covering the village in fresh white silence. But Hamish knew that beneath that silence, secrets were stirring. Someone in Lockdup was a murderer, and it was his job to find them. He sighed, pulled on his jacket, and headed out into the night. Lugs would be waiting, and there was work to be done. Chapter 3. Beneath the Music. The morning after the Saley dawned grey and sullen, as if the sky itself disapproved of what had happened in Lockdub. Hamish sat at his kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold, staring at his notes, while Lug snored by the stove with the dedication of an Olympic athlete. He had been up until 3 a.m. compiling statements, and his eyes felt like they'd been sandpapered. The problem with murder in a small village was that everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant that every interview came with a side helping of gossip, speculation, and ancient feuds that had nothing whatsoever to do with the case at hand. His mobile phone rang, shattering the peaceful morning. Dr. Dalrymple's voice came through crisp and professional. "Antifreeze," she said without preamble. "Ethylene glycol, to be specific. Mixed into the mulled wine. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. It's sweet, you see. Masks well in spiced drinks. By the time the victim realises something's wrong, it's far too late." Hamish felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. How much would it take? Not much. A few tablespoons stirred into a glass would be fatal. The symptoms match perfectly. The rapid onset, the metabolic acidosis, the facial flushing we saw. He wouldn't have known what was happening until his kidneys began to fail. And by then... She trailed off. "Aye," Hamish said heavily. "I understand, thank you, Jennifer." "There's something else," she added. "I found traces of it in only one glass, the one that rolled from his hand. None of the other drinks at the table tested positive. This was targeted, Hamish. Someone wanted Alistair McKinnon dead and only Alistair McKinnon." After he rang off, Hamish sat for a long moment thinking. Antifreeze wasn't something you carried around in your pocket on the off chance you might need to poison someone. This was premeditated. Someone had come to the Scilly prepared to kill. The village hall looked forlorn in the morning light, its festive decorations now hanging like tired prisoners awaiting execution. A handful of volunteers had gathered to take down the tinsel and pack away the unused food, moving with the subdued efficiency of people performing an unwelcome duty. Jessie Curry was balanced precariously on a stepladder, unwinding fairy lights with the grim determination of someone defusing a bomb. "Terrible business," she announced as Hamish entered. "Terrible business. Who'd have thought we'd have a murderer in locked up? A murderer in locked up, Nessie echoed from across the hall, where she was folding tablecloths with unnecessary violence. We don't know it was murder yet, Hamish lied, knowing full well that the whole village would know about the antifreeze by lunchtime despite his best efforts. Oh, come now, Hamish, Jessie said, descending the ladder with surprising agility for a woman her age. Dr. Dalrymple's car was at the police station at 6 this morning. You don't have consultations at that hour unless it's serious. Poison, isn't it? It had to be poison the way he went down. There were times when Hamish wondered if the Curry twins had the hall bugged. Their intelligence network would put MI5 to shame. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, he said firmly. But I would like to ask you about last night. You were both here all evening? Of course we were, Nessie said, looking offended at the suggestion they might have been anywhere else. We always come to the Saley. Always. Been coming for 40 years, haven't we, Jessie? 40 years. Did you see anyone acting suspiciously around the refreshment table? The twins exchanged glances, a whole conversation passing between them in that look. Well, Nessie began slowly. There was that Eiley Fraser, in and out all evening with present glasses. Very helpful, very organised. Too organised, if you ask me. Too organised, Jessie agreed darkly. What do you mean by that? Just that she knew where everything was, didn't she? Knew the layout of the kitchen, knew where the spare glasses were kept, knew when to refill the mulled wine, and are only here since September. Hamish made a note, though he suspected the twins were simply suspicious of anyone who wasn't born within 5 miles of Lochdoub. Still, Eiley Fraser had been near the drinks all evening. That couldn't be ignored. And anyone else? That Robert Lennox from Inverness, Nessie said, warming to her theme. Came in late, didn't he? Stood near the back, looking like thunder. We asked around, and it turns out he had business with McKinnon. Money business. Money business, Jessie confirmed with relish. This was new information. Hamish felt the familiar tingle of a lead worth following. What kind of money business? Debts, supposedly. Heard them arguing outside around 8 o'clock. Couldn't hear the words, mind, but the tone was clear enough. Lennox was furious. After extracting what few other details the twins could provide, Hamish left them to their decorations and drove to Inverness. Robert Lennox lived in a modest terraced house near the town centre, the kind of place that spoke of reduced circumstances and dwindling prospects. The man who answered the door looked like he hadn't slept. He was in his 50s, grey-faced and hollow-eyed, wearing a cardigan that had seen better decades. Mr. Lennox, I'm Police Sergeant Hamish Macbeth from Lochdoub. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Alistair McKinnon. Lennox's shoulders sagged. I suppose you would. You better come in. The house was tidy but worn, decorated with the care of someone who couldn't afford to replace anything. Lennox gestured Hamish to a sofa and sat down heavily in an armchair. I didn't kill him, he said flatly. I wanted to, God knows, but I didn't. Why would you want to kill him? Because the bastard nearly ruined me, Lennox's voice was bitter. We were business partners 5 years ago down in Glasgow, property development. Then the market crashed and suddenly McKinnon was claiming I'd mismanaged funds, that I owed him money I'd never borrowed. Took me to court, cost me everything, my business, my marriage, my reputation. But you came to the Saley last night. I'd heard he was living up in Lochdoub. Heard he was throwing money around, playing the big man. I wanted to confront him, make him admit what he'd done. So I drove up there and waited outside until I saw him arrive. And did you confront him? I did. Grabbed him by the arm as he was going in, told him I knew he'd lied in court, that he'd falsified documents. You know what he did? Lennox laughed, but there was no humour in it. He smiled, said the past was the past and I should move on, told me I was making a scene. What did you do then? I walked away, sat in my car for 10 minutes trying to calm down, then drove home. I never went inside that hall, Sergeant. I never touched his drink or his food or anything else. I'm many things, but I'm not a murderer. Hamish studied him carefully. The man seemed genuine in his misery, but genuine misery didn't preclude murder. Still, something about the story rang true. Can anyone verify that you left? The woman who was helping at the door saw me walk away. Auburn hair, friendly looking. She asked if I was all right. Ailey Fraser again. Hamish made another note. Back in Loch Dubh, he stopped at Archie McLean's cottage, a low stone building that smelled of smoke and fish. Archie answered the door with a mug of something that was definitely not tea in his hand. Hamish, come in. I suppose you're here about those council records McKinnon mentioned. I am. Archie waved him to a seat and poured another generous measure of whiskey into a second mug. There's nothing to it, I tell you. Back in the 90s, we all bent the rules a bit with the fishing quotas. Times were hard, and the regulations seemed designed by idiots who'd never seen a boat, let alone worked one. And McKinnon knew about this? He'd been poking around in old council records, preparing some report about the economic history of the area. Daft as a brush, the whole project. But he found some discrepancies and came round here making veiled threats about public interest and accountability. Did you believe he'd actually report you? Archie shrugged. He might have. The man had no sense of proportion. But those records are 25 years old, Hamish. The Fisheries Commission has bigger problems than ancient quota violations. I told him to do his worst. And that was the end of it. More or less. He muttered something about people needing to be held accountable, and I told him to take his accountability and stick it where the sun doesn't shine. It was mid-afternoon by the time Hamish returned to the police station. The half-finished glass of mulled wine sat in an evidence bag on his desk, waiting to be sent to Strathbane. He stared at it, thinking about antifreeze, about opportunity, about someone moving through a crowded hall with murder in mind. Someone had planned this carefully. Someone had brought poison to a Christmas telly and slipped it into one specific glass among dozens. The question was who had both the means and the opportunity. Outside, the snow had started falling again, covering Loch Dubh in fresh white innocence. But Hamish knew that innocence, like snow, never lasted long. Chapter 4. Old Grudges and New Money. Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived at the police station the following morning with the swagger of a man who believed himself to be in charge of something important. Hamish, who had been enjoying a peaceful breakfast of porridge and contemplation, heard the car door slam with unnecessary force and resigned himself to an unpleasant hour. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, bursting through the door without knocking. "Progress report, now!" Luggs raised his head from his basket, assessed the situation with the wisdom of long experience, and went back to sleep. Hamish set down his spoon with deliberate care. "Good morning to you too, sir. Would you care for some tea?" "I don't want tea. I want answers. What have you got?" "Antifreeze in the mulled wine," as Dr. Dalrymple confirmed. Several suspects with motives ranging from financial disputes to blackmail threats. No solid evidence pointing to any one person. Blair's face, already red from the cold, deepened to purple. "That's it? That's what you've been doing while I've been fending off reporters and calls from the chief constable?" "I've been conducting interviews and gathering information," Hamish said mildly. "These things take time." "Time," Blair snorted. "What they take is proper detective work, not sitting around drinking tea in your cosy wee station. I want background checks on everyone who was at that Keeley. I want financial records, phone logs, the lot." "On the entire village?" "On anyone who had contact with the deceased. And speaking of which, what do we know about McKinnon himself? Man doesn't just turn up in the Highlands with a pocket full of money for no reason." This, Hamish had to admit, was a fair point. He'd been so focused on the villagers' motives that he had given little thought to what had brought Alistair McKinnon north in the first place. After Blair departed in a cloud of self-importance and exhaust fumes, Hamish settled down at his computer to do some digging. The internet, for all its faults, was remarkably good at preserving people's misdeeds for posterity. Alistair McKinnon, it turned out, had quite a history. Born in Glasgow 53 years ago, he'd made his fortune in property development during the boom years, then lost most of it in a series of lawsuits and settlements. The most recent case had been settled just 6 months before his arrival in Loch Dubh. Hamish read through the court documents with growing interest. Mackinnon had been sued by a consortium of investors who claimed he had misrepresented the value of a development project, leading to significant financial losses. The case had been settled out of court, with Mackinnon paying an undisclosed sum and agreeing to cease all property development activities in the Glasgow area for 5 years. So he'd fled north, Hamish thought, not to start fresh, but because he had been effectively banned from operating in his old territory. He made a note to check whether any of the investors in that case had connections to Lochderb. It was a long shot, but murder often sprang from grudges that had festered over years. His mobile rang. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, with the faint trace of a Borders accent. "Sergeant Macbeth, this is Sarah Chen from the Financial Conduct Authority. I understand you're investigating the death of Alistair Mackinnon." "That's right. How can I help you?" "It's more how I can help you. Mackinnon's name has been on our radar for some time. Nothing we could prove, you understand, but there were concerns about his business practices. When I saw the news of his death, I thought you should know." "I'm listening." He had a talent for convincing people to invest in projects that didn't quite materialize as promised. Always managed to stay just this side of legal, but he left a trail of angry investors behind him. We've had 3 formal complaints in the last 2 years alone. "Any names you can share?" There was a pause. "I shouldn't, strictly speaking, but one of them was a Robert Lennox from Inverness. Does that name mean anything to you?" Hamish felt a familiar tingle of excitement. "It does indeed. Anyone else?" "A man called Gordon Fraser, also from the Glasgow area. His complaint was more recent, filed just 8 months ago. Claimed Mackinnon had cheated his late father out of a considerable sum." Fraser. The same surname as Eiley. Hamish's mind raced. "Do you have contact details from Mr. Fraser?" "I'm afraid Mr. Fraser died 7 months ago. Took his own life, from what I understand, left a widow and a sister, but I don't have their information." After thanking Sarah Chen and ending the call, Hamish sat very still, thinking. A sister. Eiley Fraser had arrived in Lochderb in September, just 2 months after Gordon Fraser's death. That seemed like a coincidence too large to ignore. He drove to the small cottage Eiley rented on the outskirts of the village, a neat stone building with smoke curling from its chimney. She answered the door, still wearing an apron, her hands dusted with flour. "Sergeant Macbeth, what a surprise! I'm just making bread. Would you like to come in?" The cottage was warm and tidy, smelling of yeast and cinnamon. Watercolours of Highland landscapes hung on the walls, and a stack of library books sat on the side table. It looked like the home of someone settling in for a long stay. "I'll not take much of your time," Hamish said, accepting a seat at the kitchen table. "I just have a few follow-up questions about the night of the Ceilidh." "Of course, anything I can do to help." She poured tea without asking, moving with the easy hospitality of someone comfortable in her own space. "You mentioned you'd been volunteering at village events since you arrived. What brought you to Lochderb?" "A fresh start," she said easily. "I've been living in Glasgow for years, and after my brother died, I needed a change. The Highlands seemed like the right place for it." "I'm sorry for your loss. What was your brother's name?" Something flickered in her eyes, quick as a bird's shadow. "Gordon Fraser. He died last summer." "That must have been difficult." "It was." She set down the teapot with hands that were perfectly steady. He'd been struggling for a while, depression, financial troubles. In the end, it all became too much for him. "Financial troubles?" "Bad investments, mostly. He trusted the wrong people. My brother was brilliant in many ways, but he could be naive when it came to business." Hamish sipped his tea, watching her over the rim of his cup. Did he ever mention Alistair Mackinnon? The question hung in the air between them. Eiley's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle tightening that spoke volumes. "Once or twice," she said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Just trying to understand all the connections. Mackinnon seems to have had a talent for making enemies." "That he did?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Though I suppose speaking ill of the dead is poor form, especially so close to Christmas. You were very helpful at the Cayley. Hamish continued, changing tack. The Curry twins mentioned you seem to know the hall layout very well. I'd been there several times before, the harvest supper, the church social. After a few events you learn where things are kept. And you were refilling drinks all evening. Someone had to. The mulled wine was very popular. I must have gone back and forth a dozen times. Did you notice anyone acting strangely around the refreshment table? She considered this. Not really. We were crowded, people coming and going. Though I did see that man from Inverness, Robert Lennox, lurking near the door for a while. He looked angry about something. You spoke with him? Briefly. After he had words with Mackinnon outside he came back in looking upset. I asked if he was all right, and he muttered something about the past catching up with people. Then he left. This matched what Lennox had told him. Hamish made a mental note. One last question, he said, setting down his cup. The mulled wine you were serving, did you prepare it yourself? Good heavens, no. Mrs. Wellington made it. She always does. It's her grandmother's recipe, and she's very particular about it. I just heated it up and kept the pot filled. After leaving Eileen's cottage, Hamish sat in his Land Rover for a long moment, thinking. She'd been open about her brother, about Gordon Fraser's death and his connection to Mackinnon. That suggested either innocence or a very clever attempt to deflect suspicion by appearing cooperative. But the timing troubled him. Gordon Fraser dies after losing money to Mackinnon. 2 months later, his sister moves to the same small Highland village where Mackinnon has relocated. She volunteers for every event, putting herself in position to know the routines, the layouts, the patterns. It could be coincidence. But Hamish had been a policeman long enough to know that in murder cases, coincidence was usually just motive wearing a disguise. He started the engine and headed back to the station. There were more questions to ask, more threads to follow. And somewhere in the tangle of old grudges and new money, someone had found a reason to kill. The snow had stopped falling, leaving Lochduba pristine and peaceful under a pale winter sun. But Hamish knew that peace, like snow, could hide a multitude of sins. Chapter 5, Suspects Under the Mistletoe. The Italian restaurant in Strathbane was the kind of place that tried too hard, with plastic grapevines draped over fake stone walls and a menu that promised authenticity while delivering microwaved mediocrity. Hamish sat across from Detective Sergeant Mary Graham, who had the unenviable task of being Blair's second-in-command while maintaining her sanity and competence. "Tell me you've got something," she said, tacking her lasagna with the vigour of someone who hadn't eaten since breakfast. "Blair's breathing down my neck about closing this case before Hogmanay. Says it's bad for tourism." "Since when does Blair care about tourism?" "Since the Chief Constable mentioned it in the same breath as budget allocations." Mary took a long drink of water. "So what have we got? Multiple suspects, I'm hearing." Hamish pulled out his notebook, its pages already dog-eared from constant reference. "Robert Lennox from Inverness. Mackinnon ruined him financially 5 years ago. He was at the Saleys specifically to confront him. Strong motive. Aye, but he claims he left after the confrontation. Never went inside the hall. We've got a witness who saw him walking away upset." "Who's the witness?" Eiley Fraser, one of the volunteers. Mary raised an eyebrow. "And where does she fit in all this?" "That's the interesting part. Her brother Gordon Fraser filed a complaint against Mackinnon 8 months ago, then killed himself 7 months ago. She moved to Lochduba 2 months later." "That's not suspicious at all," Mary said dryly. "Please tell me you've looked into her background." "Working on it. She's been cooperative, helpful even, but the timing's too convenient to ignore." "Who else?" "Archie McLean, local fisherman. Mackinnon threatened to expose old fishing quota violations from the 90s. Archie claims the records are ancient history, and he wasn't worried. But a threat's still a threat." Mary made notes on her own pad. "Motive seems weak. People don't usually commit murder over 25-year-old paperwork. You'd be surprised what people kill for in small villages. Pride runs deep here." Fair point. Anyone else? Morven MacLeod. McKinnon wanted to buy her family farm, called it underutilised. She hated him for it, didn't hide the fact. But she's got an alibi, witnesses putting her on the dance floor during the relevant time. Unless she had an accomplice. Hamish shook his head. Morven's not the type. If she was going to kill someone, she'd do it herself and probably tell you about it afterward. No subterfuge in that woman. Mary smiled. I like her already. Anyone else I should know about? Callum Ross, the fiddler, apparently had a public argument with McKinnon earlier in the evening. About what? That's what I'm driving to Ullapool to find out. He lives up there. Only came down for the Keeley because they were paying good money. The drive to Ullapool took 2 hours, through increasingly dramatic scenery, the road winding between mountains that looked like sleeping giants under their blanket of snow. Ooh. Hamish found Callum Ross in a small music shop near the harbour, repairing a violin with the concentration of a surgeon. He was younger than Hamish expected, perhaps 35, with the lean build of a distance runner and fingers that moved with practiced precision over the instrument's bridge. Sergeant Macbeth? Callum looked up, his expression wary. I wondered when you'd get round to me. You don't seem surprised. Man drops dead at a Sealy where I was playing, and I'd had words with him earlier. I'd be dense not to expect a visit. He set down the violin carefully. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're asking. Why don't you tell me about the argument? Callum sighed and gestured to a couple of chairs in the corner of the shop. It was stupid, really. McKinnon had been drinking, got it into his head that we should be playing more authentic music. Started demanding reels his grandmother used to dance to, tunes nobody's played in 50 years. When I told him we had a set list, he got aggressive. How aggressive? Loud, insulting, called me a charlatan, said I was ruining traditional Scottish music by modernising it, which is rich coming from a man who'd never played an instrument in his life. Callum's jaw tightened. I may have told him where he could stick his opinions. What time was this? Around 7:30, just before we started the second set. He stormed off toward the drinks table, and I didn't see him again until they started screaming that he was dead. Can anyone verify this? The whole band heard it. McKinnon wasn't exactly quiet, and Mrs. Wellington came over afterward to apologise for him, said he'd had too much mulled wine already. Hamish made notes. Did you see anyone else arguing with him that evening? Half the village seemed like. Man had a gift for rubbing people wrong. There was some bloke from out of town having a go at him outside before we even started playing. Didn't catch what it was about. Robert Lennox. If you say so. And Morven MacLeod gave him an earful during the first break, something about her land. Oh, and that cheerful woman helping with the food, she had to calm him down at one point. Eiley Fraser? That's the one. McKinnon was complaining about the mulled wine being too sweet, getting quite nasty about it. She just smiled and offered to make him a fresh cup. Patience of a saint, that woman. Hamish felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Did she make him a fresh cup? I assume so. She took his glass away and came back a few minutes later with another one. Why? Just gathering information. Hamish kept his voice neutral. Did you notice anything else unusual that evening? Callum thought for a moment. Not really. It was a typical village ceilidh, all the usual drama and dancing, though I did wonder why McKinnon was so keen to sponsor it. Man clearly had no love for traditional Scottish culture, and he didn't seem to enjoy himself much. What do you mean? He was watching people all evening, not dancing, not really socialising, just watching with this odd expression, like he was taking notes. Made me think he was planning something, though God knows what. After leaving Ullapool, Hamish stopped at a cafe overlooking the harbour to organise his thoughts. The coffee was terrible, but the view was spectacular, the winter sun turning the water to beaten silver. He now had 4 solid suspects, each with their own motive. Robert Lennox, whose life McKinnon had destroyed. Archie MacLean, threatened with exposure. Morven MacLeod, fighting to keep her family land. Callum Ross, publicly humiliated. and hovering around all of them like a helpful ghost, Ailey Fraser, present at every crucial moment, refilling drinks, calming arguments, taking McKinnon's glass and bringing him a fresh one. Too helpful, the Curry twins had said, and they weren't wrong. His phone rang. Mary Graham's voice came through urgent. "Hamish, I've been digging into Ailey Fraser's background. Her real name is Elaine Fraser. Changed it by deed poll 3 months ago." Why would she change her name? That's the question, isn't it? I'm still working on it, but there's more. Her brother Gordon didn't just lose money to McKinnon. Gordon testified against McKinnon in one of those investor lawsuits, tried to expose him. McKinnon's lawyers destroyed him on the stand, made him look incompetent and vindictive. And then Gordon killed himself. 6 weeks later, left a note saying he couldn't live with the shame. Hamish closed his eyes. Motive. Clear, powerful, devastating motive. "There's something else," Mary continued. "I checked her movements before she came to Loughdub. She was working in Glasgow as a nurse, but she quit her job the week after McKinnon settled in the Highlands. Gave notice, sold her flat, moved north. All very deliberate. She followed him. Looks that way. And here's the kicker. I found her internet search history from her old laptop, which the Glasgow police seized after Gordon's death as part of the suicide investigation. 6 months ago, she was researching antifreeze poisoning, specifically how it tastes in sweet drinks. The pieces were falling into place with the inevitability of dominoes. Hamish sat very still, watching the gulls wheel over the harbour. She planned this, he said quietly. Months of planning, following him north, establishing herself in the village, volunteering for events, so she'd have access and opportunity. Want me to bring her in? Not yet. We need more than internet searches and suspicious timing. We need evidence. Be careful, Hamish. If she's killed once, she might not hesitate to do it again. After Mary rang off, Hamish sat for a long time, nursing his cold coffee and watching the winter light fade over the water. He thought about Ailey Fraser's kind eyes and steady hands, about her bread-making and her watercolours, about the careful way she'd built a life in Loughdub, all of it a lie, all of it leading to one moment at a Christmas silly, when she had slipped poison into a glass of mulled wine and watched a man die. The question was how to prove it. Chapter 6. False Tunes. The problem with having multiple suspects, Hamish reflected as he sat in his office the next morning, was that they all started to look equally guilty until you examined them closely. Then, with depressing regularity, they started to look equally innocent. He spread his notes across the desk, organising them into columns while Lug snored rhythmically in the background. The dog had perfected the art of sleeping through investigations, waking only for meals and the occasional emergency involving cats. Robert Lennox, strong motive, opportunity, and no real alibi beyond his own word that he had left after the confrontation. But something about the man's defeated air had rung true. He'd been broken by McKinnon years ago. Why wait until now for revenge? And more importantly, why travel to a public event to commit murder when there were 100 easier, more private opportunities? Hamish picked up his phone and dialed Mary Graham. "I need you to check something for me," he said when she answered. "Robert Lennox's financial situation, specifically whether you received any settlement money from McKinnon in the past year." "On it. That's it. Why?" "Just a hunch." The answer came back within 2 hours. Mary's voice carried a note of surprise. "You were right. McKinnon settled with Lennox 6 months ago. Paid him £40,000 in exchange for dropping all future claims. The money went through in July. 6 months before the murder. Exactly. Which means Lennox's debt was resolved long before anyone died. Considerably weakens his motive, wouldn't you say?" It did indeed. A man who'd been paid off had little reason to risk everything for revenge. Hamish crossed Lennox's name off his primary suspect list, though he left it visible. Never completely dismiss anyone in a murder investigation. Next was Archie McLean and his threatened exposure over fishing quotas. Hamish drove out to the harbour, where he found Archie mending nets with the patient concentration of a man who'd done it 10,000 times before. Archie? Those council records McKinnon was threatening you with. Where would he have found them? Archie looked up, his weathered face creasing in thought. The local council office in Strathbane, I suppose. They keep archives going back decades. Waste of space, if you ask me, but bureaucrats love their payer. And the records would show what exactly? Catch reports from the 90s. Some of us may have underreported our quotas during lean years. Like I told you, everyone did it. The regulations were daft. After leaving Archie, Hamish drove to Strathbane and spent a tedious hour in the council archives, a basement room that smelled of mildew and administrative despair. The clerk, a pinch-faced woman who clearly resented his intrusion, directed him to the fisheries records with the enthusiasm of someone pointing out a wasp nest. The records were there, dusty and yellowing. Hamish found Archie's name easily, enough, along with dozens of other fishermen from the same period. The discrepancies were minor, the kind of thing that might warrant a small fine in the modern era, but were barely worth mentioning in the context of the time. More importantly, he found a note dated 3 months earlier in McKinnon's handwriting, requesting copies of these specific records. And then, 1 month later, a second note from a council investigator stating that the records had been reviewed and no action would be taken due to the age of the violations and changes in regulatory frameworks. McKinnon's threat had been empty. The council had already cleared Archie before the sale even happened. Hamish pulled out his phone and called Archie. Did McKinnon come back to you after he filed his initial complaint? Eh? No. Never heard from him again after that first time. Assumed he'd decided it wasn't worth pursuing. He had decided. The council dismissed it. You were never in any real danger. There was a long silence. So he was just blowing hot air? Looks that way. Another suspect whose motive crumbled under scrutiny. Hamish drove back to Lochderb, feeling both relieved and frustrated. Relieved that 2 villagers weren't murderers. Frustrated that his suspect pool was shrinking in the wrong direction. Morven MacLeod was waiting for him at the police station, her sheepdog lying patiently by her feet. Heard you've been asking questions about me, she said without preamble. Thought I'd save you the trip. I appreciate that, though you've already got an alibi. Aye. But I thought you might want to know that McKinnon came to see me the day before the Cayley. Made me a new offer for the land. This was news. What kind of offer? A good one. Fair price, allowed me to keep the house and a parcel for the sheep. Said he'd had time to think about it and realised he'd been pushing too hard. She snorted. Didn't trust it for a minute, mind you. Man was a snake. But the offer was legitimate. Had papers drawn up by a solicitor and everything. Did you accept? I told him I'd think about it, which was my polite way of telling him to shove off, but he seemed to take it as a maybe. She studied Hamish with sharp eyes. Point is, I had no reason to kill him. If anything, keeping him alive meant I might eventually get him to go even higher on the price. It made sense. Dead men couldn't make offers, and Morven was shrewd enough to know that a living McKinnon with money was more useful than a dead one. One more question, Hamish said. During the Strip the Willow you never left the dance floor. Never. Ask anyone in that set. Angus Morrison, Flora Mackenzie, Tommy Grant. We danced 3 dances straight, and I was parched by the end of it. Went to get a drink just as the music stopped and found McKinnon on the floor. Hamish thanked her and watched her leave, the sheepdog trotting faithfully at her heel. 3 suspects down, 2 to go. Callum Ross was harder to clear, mainly because his alibi depended on the band members, and musicians were notoriously poor witnesses to anything that didn't involve music. But when Hamish called the other members of the band, their stories aligned perfectly. Callum never left the stage, the accordion player said. We played straight through from 8:15 to 9:30. Man's a professional, doesn't abandon his post even if the place is burning down. The bass player confirmed it. Aye, he was right there beside me the whole time. I'd have noticed if he'd left, what with us sharing the same sheet music stand. So Callum Ross had been visible, on stage, playing music for 100 witnesses during the exact time Mackinnon was poisoned. Unless he'd mastered teleportation or had an accomplice, he was clear, which left Eileen Fraser, or rather Elaine Fraser. Hamish sat at his desk as evening fell, reviewing everything he knew. She had motive, her brother's suicide. She had opportunity, volunteering at events, learning the layout, having access to drinks. She had means, the research into antifreeze, the deliberate move to Lockdub. And she had something none of the other suspects had: premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion or impulse. This was planned, careful, executed with the precision of someone who'd thought through every detail. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was the Curry twins talking over each other in their usual fashion. "Hamish, we remembered something." "Remembered something?" "Slow down," he said. "One at a time." "It's about Eileen Fraser," Nessie said, her voice crackling with excitement. "We were thinking about that night, and we remembered she arrived early, very early, was in the hall at 5 o'clock, 2 hours before anyone else." 2 hours, Jessie confirmed. "Said she wanted to make sure everything was ready," Nessie continued. "But the thing is, Mrs. Wellington had already set up the mulled wine pot. It was sitting there on the table when Ailie arrived." Sitting there on the table? Hamish felt his pulse quicken. And Ailie was alone with it? For at least half an hour before Mrs. Wellington came back. We only know because we arrived at 5:30 to set up the decorations and saw her there by herself. After the twins rang off, Hamish sat very still, the pieces clicking into place. Ailie had been alone with the mulled wine pot for 30 minutes. Plenty of time to add antifreeze to one specific glass, mark it somehow, ensure that it would go to Mackinnon and only Mackinnon. But how had she gotten him to drink from that specific glass? That was the question that still nagged. He needed to talk to Ailie again, but this time he needed to be very, very careful. Outside, the stars were coming out over Lockdub, cold and distant. The village was settling into its evening routines, lights flickering on in cottage windows, smoke rising from chimneys. Peaceful, ordinary, innocent, but Hamish knew, but better. Somewhere in that peaceful village was a woman who had committed the perfect murder, and it was his job to prove it. Chapter 7. The Helpful Stranger. Hamish spent the morning doing something he should have done days ago. Proper background research on Aileen Fraser, or rather Elaine Fraser as he now knew her to be. The deed poll changing her name had been filed in Glasgow 3 months prior. A simple process, requiring only a statutory declaration and a small fee. Aileen was softer than Elaine, more Highland, less likely to trigger recognition in anyone who might have known her brother. He found Gordon Fraser's obituary easily enough. It painted the picture of a man who'd had promise, a degree in business, early success in property management, a wife who'd divorced him 2 years before his death. The obituary mentioned his surviving sister Elaine, but gave no details about the circumstances of his death beyond the usual euphemisms about tragic loss and taken too soon. The newspaper articles were more forthcoming. Gordon Fraser, aged 41, had been found dead in his flat from an overdose of sleeping pills. The coroner had ruled it suicide. He'd left a note, though its contents hadn't been made public. What interested Hamish more was an article from 6 months earlier, detailing a civil lawsuit against Alistair Mackinnon. Gordon Fraser had been one of 3 investors who'd claimed Mackinnon misrepresented a property development scheme. The case had been settled out of court, but not before Gordon had given testimony that Mackinnon's lawyers had systematically dismantled. Mr. Fraser appeared confused and contradictory, the article quoted the judge as saying. His allegations lacked supporting documentation, and his demeanour suggested personal animosity rather than factual grievance. Hamish could imagine how that must have felt, standing in court trying to expose a fraud only to be made to look like a vindictive fool. The shame would have been crushing. He found Gordon's sister through employment records. Elaine Fraser had worked as a theatre nurse at Glasgow Royal Infirmary for 12 years, with an exemplary record. She'd specialised in surgical procedures, which meant she knew her way around medications, dosages, and poisons. Her resignation letter was dated the 1st of August, 2 weeks after Alistair McKinnon had purchased the distillery house in Lockdub. Not a coincidence. Mary Graham called just before noon with more information. "I've been talking to Elaine Fraser's former colleagues at the hospital," she said. "Universally liked, apparently. Competent, caring, never any complaints. But one of the nurses mentioned that Elaine changed after her brother died. Became withdrawn, stopped socialising, spent her breaks reading on her phone." Reading what? The nurse didn't know, but she remembered Elaine asking odd questions about antifreeze one day. Said she was worried about her neighbour's cat drinking from a puddle in the garage. The nurse thought it was sweet, how concerned she was. When was this? Early July, about a month before she quit. Hamish thanked Mary and sat back in his chair thinking. The timeline was damning. Gordon dies in June. Elaine starts researching antifreeze in July. McKinnon moves to Locked in August. Elaine quits her job and follows him in September. By October, she's volunteering at every village event, learning routines, becoming indispensable. But there was still a gap in the evidence. Knowing someone had motive and opportunity wasn't the same as proving they'd committed murder. He needed something concrete, something that would hold up in court. The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Wellington, the village's self-appointed social organiser and keeper of traditions, appeared at the police station that afternoon carrying a cardboard box. "Hamish Macbeth, I've been turning my house upside down looking for this," she announced, setting the box on his desk with a thump. "Found it this morning behind the preserves in the pantry. What is it?" "My good thermos, the one I use for keeping drinks hot at outdoor events. I've been looking for it since the Sealy, thought maybe I'd left it at the hall." She opened the box to reveal a large stainless steel thermos, the kind that could hold several litres. Hamish stared at it. "You didn't find this at the hall?" "No, that's the odd thing. Found it tucked behind my pantry shelves, and I know I didn't put it there. I'm very particular about where I store things." She frowned. "The stranger thing is, it's been washed. Thoroughly washed. Smells of bleach." "May I keep this?" "Well, I was hoping to get it back eventually. But if it's important to the investigation..." She trailed off, eyes bright with curiosity. After Mrs. Wellington left, Hamish examined the thermos carefully. It had indeed been scrubbed clean, but even bleach couldn't remove every trace. He called the forensics lab in Strathbane and arranged for immediate pickup. The results came back the next morning. Traces of ethylene glycol in the seal and in microscopic scratches on the interior surface. Someone had used this thermos to transport antifreeze. "Mrs. Wellington's thermos," Mary said when Hamish called to tell her. "Why would the killer use Mrs. Wellington's thermos?" "Because it wouldn't look suspicious. Volunteers at village events are always carrying things back and forth. Thermoses, serving jugs, food containers. Nobody pays attention." "But how did it end up in Mrs. Wellington's pantry?" That was the question. Hamish drove to Mrs. Wellington's substantial house on the edge of the village. She greeted him with tea and anxiety. "I've been thinking about that thermos," she said, pouring from her second-best teapot. "And I remembered something. The day after the Sealy, Ellie Fraser stopped by with some leftover shortbread. Said she'd found it in the hall kitchen and thought I might want it. Did she come inside?" "Oh yes, I was in a state over poor Mr. McKinnon dying. She made me sit down, made me tea, very kind. She was in the kitchen for a few minutes sorting out the shortbread." "The kitchen, where you keep your pantry." Mrs. Wellington's hand froze halfway to her mouth. "You don't think..." "I think someone borrowed your thermos without asking, used it for something they shouldn't have, cleaned it thoroughly, and then returned it hoping you wouldn't notice." "But that's dreadful. Using my things for murder." Mrs. Wellington looked genuinely affronted, as if the murder itself was less offensive than the unauthorised borrowing of kitchenware. The pieces were falling into place, but Hamish still needed the final connection. How had Elaine ensured that McKinnon, and only Mackinnon drank the poisoned wine. He went back to the hall, now empty and cold. The decorations had all been taken down, leaving it bare and echoing. He stood where the refreshment table had been, trying to visualize the scene. Ailey had arrived early. She'd been alone with the mulled wine pot. She could have prepared a poisoned glass, but how would she have marked it to ensure it went to the right person? He thought about Callum Ross's statement. Mackinnon had complained about the wine being too sweet. Ailey had taken his glass and brought him a fresh one. She hadn't needed to mark a glass in advance. She'd simply waited for Mackinnon to complain, as she'd known he would. The man complained about everything. Then she had taken his glass, gone to the kitchen where the thermos was hidden, poured antifreeze into a fresh glass of mulled wine, and brought it back to him with a smile. Simple, elegant, nearly impossible to prove without a confession. Hamish drove to Eileith's cottage as the sun was setting. She answered the door wearing an apron again, her hands covered in paint this time rather than flour. "Sergeant Macbeth, what a nice surprise. I'm just working on a watercolour. Would you like to come in?" "Thank you." The cottage was warm and welcoming as before. The watercolour on her easel showed Loch Dubh in winter, the mountains purple against an orange sky. It was quite good. "You're very talented," Hamish said. "Thank you. I find painting peaceful. It helps me process things." She wiped her hands on a cloth. "Would you like tea?" "No, thank you. I just have a few more questions about the night of the Sailie." "Of course, anything I can do to help." Hamish watched her carefully as he spoke. "I've been looking into your background, Elaine." The use of her real name hit like a physical blow. She went very still, her hand frozen on the paintbrush. "It's Ailey," she said quietly. "It wasn't always. You changed it 3 months ago in Glasgow, just before you moved here." She set down the brush with exaggerated care. "That's not illegal." "No, it's not. But it is interesting. Especially given that your brother Gordon Fraser testified against Alistair Mackinnon 6 months before changing his name. 6 weeks later, Gordon killed himself. My brother had depression. It wasn't about Mackinnon." "Wasn't it? I've read the trial transcripts. I've seen how Mackinnon's lawyers humiliated him. Gordon's suicide note mentioned shame, didn't it?" Elaine's composure was cracking. "You don't know anything about what my brother went through." "I know Mackinnon destroyed him. I know you followed Mackinnon here. I know you researched antifreeze poisoning, and I know you were alone with the mulled wine that killed him." She stood abruptly, walking to the window. In the fading light she looked older, harder. "Are you arresting me?" "Not yet, but I will be soon. We found Mrs. Wellington's thermos. The lab confirmed traces of antifreeze." There was a long silence. When Elaine spoke again, her voice was different, colder, more honest. "He killed my brother as surely as if he'd pushed him off a bridge. Gordon was a good man, Sergeant. Honest, kind, trusting. Mackinnon took advantage of that, used him, cheated him, then destroyed his reputation when Gordon tried to fight back. So you killed him." "I made sure he faced consequences for his actions. That's not quite the same thing." Hamish looked at her, standing by the window, this woman who'd seemed so helpful, so kind. "You planned it for months." "I planned it carefully," she corrected. "There's a difference." Chapter 8. A carefully played role. The silence in the cottage stretched between them like a tightrope. Elaine continued to stare out the window at the darkening mountains, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Hamish remained seated, giving her space, knowing that confessions couldn't be rushed. "You want to know how I did it?" she said finally. It wasn't a question. "I've worked most of it out, but there are gaps." She turned from the window, and in the lamplight her face had lost its softness. This was the real Elaine Fraser, the woman who'd been hiding beneath layers of cheerful helpfulness for months. "I started planning the day after Gordon's funeral," she said, her voice steady. "I was going through his things, found all his notes about Mackinnon, evidence he'd tried to gather, documents he'd collected. The man had ruined him systematically, deliberately, and Mackinnon walked away without consequence. So you decided to be the consequence." "I decided he needed to pay. She moved to the armchair across from Hamish, sitting with the careful posture of someone testifying. I spent weeks researching, not just antifreeze, though that was part of it. I researched Mackinnon himself, his patterns, his habits, where he'd gone after Glasgow. How did you find out about Lockdub? Property records are public. I saw he'd purchased the distillery house, and I knew. She sampled without humour. It was perfect, really. A small village where a newcomer could blend in if she was useful enough, where a volunteer would have access to events, to kitchens, to opportunities. You moved here in September. I found work at the surgery in Breaky, but I made sure everyone knew I was available for village events. Mrs. Wellington practically threw the volunteer opportunities at me. People are grateful when you offer to help, Sergeant. They don't question it. Hamish thought of all the times he'd seen her at various events, always with a tray or a cloth, always smiling, always in the right place at the right time, invisible in her usefulness. The Ceilidh, he prompted. I knew Mackinnon would sponsor it. The man couldn't resist playing benefactor, showing off his money. I volunteered immediately. She leaned forward slightly. The first time I helped at the harvest supper, I learned where everything was kept in the hall kitchen. The second time at the church social, I memorised the routines. By the third event, nobody questioned my presence anywhere. And the antifreeze? Purchased in Inverness, 3 different shops, small bottles each time, paid cash, poured it into Mrs. Wellington's thermos the night before the Ceilidh. She always left it in her pantry when she wasn't using it, never locked her back door. Returning it was even easier after the murder, when everyone was distracted and grateful for comfort. The casual way she discussed it chilled Hamish more than any dramatics would have. This was premeditation at its coldest. The Ceilidh itself, he said. Walk me through it. Elaine settled back in her chair, and for a moment she looked almost nostalgic, as if recounting a particularly successful dinner party. I arrived at 5 o'clock, said I wanted to help set up. Mrs. Wellington had already prepared the mulled wine in the big pot. I thanked her, sent her off to check on the band. I had the thermos in my bag wrapped in a towel. But you couldn't poison the whole pot. Of course not. That would have killed innocents. For the first time, something like emotion crossed her face. I only wanted Mackinnon dead. Nobody else deserved to suffer. So how did you ensure only he drank it? I studied him, Sergeant. For months I studied him. The man was predictable in his unpleasantness. He complained about everything. Food too cold, music too loud, wine too sweet. I knew he'd complain about the mulled wine. I just had to wait for it. And when he did, I was ready. He made his usual fuss around 8:30, waving his glass around and announcing to anyone who'd listened that Mrs. Wellington had made it too sweet this year. I went to him immediately, all concerned helpfulness, offered to make him a fresh glass from the kitchen. Hamish could picture it perfectly. Mackinnon, red-faced and pompous. Elaine, sympathetic and efficient. I took his glass to the kitchen, she continued, poured a fresh glass of mulled wine from the pot, added approximately 3 tablespoons of antifreeze from the thermos, stirred it well. The sweetness of the wine masked it completely, and brought it back to him. He took it without even thanking me, drank half of it immediately, probably to make a point about how much better this glass was. Her voice hardened. He was still drinking it when I went to refill the shortbread platter. 10 minutes later, he was on the floor. The detail that struck Hamish most was how little satisfaction she seemed to take in it. There was no gloating, no triumph, just a grim recitation of facts, as if she were describing a medical procedure rather than murder. You felt nothing when he died? I felt relieved, and I felt sad because nothing could bring Gordon back. She met his eyes directly. I don't regret it, Sergeant. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. Murder is never necessary. Isn't it? What else was there? He'd already been through the courts. He'd settled, paid money, moved on. Gordon was still dead. Where was the justice in that? Justice isn't yours to dispense. Then whose is it? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. The courts failed. The law failed. Someone had to act. Hamish thought about all the times he'd bent rules in Loch-Dubh, turned blind eyes to minor transgressions, valued Highland justice over the letter of the law. But this was different. This was murder, planned and executed with chilling precision. The antifreeze, he said. Where did you learn about it specifically? Nursing school, initially. We studied various poisonings for emergency treatment protocols, but I researched it thoroughly afterward. The symptoms, the timeline, the dosage required. I wanted to be certain it would work. And the others at the Saley? Lennox, Archie, Morven? Did you know they had motives too? I knew McKinnon had enemies. That's partly why I chose such a public venue. I thought it would muddy the waters, create doubt, and honestly, Sergeant, I thought you'd arrest Lennox. The man had been shouting at McKinnon outside the hall. He seemed the obvious suspect. But you underestimated small-town gossip. The Curry twins noticed you'd arrived early. For the first time she smiled genuinely. The Curry twins notice everything. I should have factored that in. And you underestimated how thoroughly we'd investigate. I suppose I did. She looked down at her paint-stained hands. I thought if I was helpful enough, cooperative enough, nobody would look too closely. The helpful volunteer is invisible, after all. Not to a good detective. No, she agreed, not to you. Hamish pulled out his phone. Elaine Fraser. I'm arresting you for the murder of Alistair McKinnon. You have the right to remain alert. She listened to the caution without protest, without tears. When he finished, she asked only one question. May I finish my painting first? It's nearly done, and I'd like to complete it. I'm sorry, we need to go now. She nodded, accepting this. Will you tell them I'm sorry, the village I mean? They've been kind to me. I hate that I lied to them. You can tell them yourself at the trial. No, she said quietly. I think I'll plead guilty. There's no point dragging this out and the evidence is clear. I just want it over with. They drove to Strathbane in silence. Elaine sat in the back seat, looking out at the passing landscape as if memorising it. When they arrived at the station, Blair was waiting with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd solved the case himself. Excellent work, Macbeth, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. We'll take it from here. Hamish handed over his notes and watched as Elaine was processed. She moved through it all with quiet dignity, answering questions clearly, refusing a lawyer. As he drove back to Loch-Dubh through the winter darkness, Hamish thought about justice and revenge, about the line between them and how easily it could blur. Elaine Fraser had committed murder, there was no question of that, but she'd done it for love of her brother, for a sense of justice denied. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained it. And in the Highlands, where family loyalty ran deeper than law, explanations mattered. Chapter 9. The Song Behind the Silence. The news of Elaine Fraser's arrest spread through Loch-Dubh with the speed of a winter gale. By the time Hamish returned from Strathbane, the village was in a state of shock that even the Curry twins couldn't adequately express, though they tried valiantly. He found them waiting outside the police station the next morning, bundled against the cold and vibrating with the need to discuss events. We never suspected, Nessie said, which wasn't entirely true given their earlier comments about Ailey being too helpful. Never suspected, Jessie echoed. She seemed so nice, Nessie continued. So willing to help with everything. Who'd have thought she was planning murder all along? Planning murder all along. Hamish, who hadn't slept well, found their distress oddly comforting. At least someone in Loch-Dubh still believed in the fundamental goodness of people, even if that belief was regularly proven misplaced. She had her reasons, he said, unlocking the station door. Reasons? Nessie looked scandalised. There's no reason good enough for murder, Hamish Macbeth. No reason good enough. But as Hamish settled into his office with a cup of tea, he thought about Elaine Fraser's face when she'd spoken of her brother. The pain had been real, even if her solution to it had been unforgivable. The phone call started shortly after. Mrs. Wellington wanted to know if she'd be needed to testify about her thermos. Archie McLean called to say he felt guilty for not noticing anything suspicious. Morven MacLeod rang to observe that she'd always thought there was something off about Eiley, though she hadn't mentioned it before now. Even Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife and one of the few people in Loch Derb with genuine psychological insight, stopped by with a basket of scones. "I've been thinking about that poor woman," she said, settling into the visitor's chair while Luggs investigated the basket hopefully. "Not excusing what she did, mind you. But grief does terrible things to people." "Aye," Hamish agreed. "Though most people don't respond to grief by committing murder. Most people don't have the opportunity or the knowledge." Angela pushed the scones toward him. "She was a nurse, you said. She'd have understood dosages, effects, timing. That kind of knowledge can be dangerous in the wrong circumstances. Or the right ones, depending on your perspective." Angela gave him a sharp look. "You're not sympathising with her?" "I'm understanding her. That's not the same thing." 2 days after the arrest, Hamish received a call from the prison in Inverness. Elaine Fraser was asking to see him. She had been formally charged with murder, had refused legal representation, and was awaiting trial. The duty solicitor assigned to her case reported that she seemed determined to plead guilty. The prison visiting room was painted in shades of institutional beige that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who spent time there. Elaine sat at a table wearing prison-issue clothing, her auburn hair pulled back severely, her face bare of makeup. She looked simultaneously older and younger, stripped of the persona she'd maintained for months. "Thank you for coming," she said as Hamish sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "You asked to see me?" "I wanted to apologise, not for what I did to McKinnon. I meant what I said about not regretting that. But for deceiving you, for making you work so hard to solve something I should have confessed to immediately." "Why didn't you?" She smiled slightly. "Pride, perhaps, or the hope that I might actually get away with it. Stupid, really. I knew the evidence would surface eventually." "The thermos was your mistake." "One of several. I should have disposed of it, thrown it in the loch with stones tied to it. But I couldn't bring myself to steal from Mrs. Wellington. Odd, isn't it? I could murder a man, but I couldn't bring myself to permanently borrow a thermos." There was a strange logic to it, Hamish supposed. Criminals often had peculiar moral boundaries. "I've been thinking about what you said," Elaine continued. "About justice not being mine to dispense. You were right, of course. But what else was there? Gordon tried the legal route. It destroyed him. So you decided to destroy McKinnon?" "I decided to make sure he faced consequences. Real consequences. Not just paying money and moving to a new place to start fresh." Her voice hardened. "He drove my brother to suicide, Sergeant. Gordon was gentle, trusting. McKinnon exploited that, then humiliated him publicly when Gordon tried to fight back. The shame of it ate him alive. And you thought murder would balance that? I thought justice should mean something. Gordon was good, McKinnon was corrupt. Where's the balance in Gordon being dead while McKinnon lived comfortably in the Highlands, playing laird?" Hamish had no answer to that. The world wasn't fair, had never been fair, would never be fair. But explaining that to someone consumed by grief seemed pointless. "The Cayley," he said instead. "Why choose such a public place? Because I wanted him to die publicly. I wanted everyone to see him collapse, to watch him lose control and dignity the way Gordon had in that courtroom." Her eyes were distant, remembering. "And I wanted it to be at Christmas, during a celebration. McKinnon loved playing benefactor, loved being the centre of attention. I wanted to take that from him." It was, Hamish thought, remarkably cruel. Not the murder itself, but the manner of it. Elaine Fraser had wanted more than death. She'd wanted humiliation. "You understand you'll go to prison for a very long time." "I understand," the solicitor says. "I'm looking at life, minimum 15 years before parole." She spoke matter-of-factly, as if discussing a train schedule. "I've made my peace with it." "Have you?" "What choice do I have? I knew the cost when I started. Planning this, I knew there was no scenario where I walked away free. I just wanted McKinnon to pay first. And now he has." "Now he has." She leaned forward slightly. Will you do something for me? Will you tell the people in Loch-Dubh that I'm sorry for deceiving them? They were kind to me. They didn't deserve to be used. You can tell them yourself when you testify. I won't be testifying. I'm pleading guilty. The whole thing will be over in a day, probably less. There's no point dragging it out. She paused. Will you tell them something else? Will you tell them that everything I told them about loving the Highlands was true? I did love it there. If things had been different, if Gordon hadn't died, I might have moved to Loch-Duff anyway. It felt like home. There was genuine regret in her voice, which made it worse somehow. She'd found a place where she could have been happy, but she'd poisoned it with murder and lies. I'll tell them, Hamish said. Thank you. She stood, signalling the end of the visit. You're a good man, Sergeant. Better than most. I hope Loch-Dubh appreciates you. As Hamish drove back through the winter landscape, the mountains dark against a pale sky, he thought about Elaine Fraser's words. She'd called him a good man, but what did that mean in the context of this case? He'd solved the murder, arrested the killer, done his job. But there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. A woman had lost her brother to greed and cruelty. In her grief, she'd become the very thing she hated. Now 2 people were dead and a third would spend the best years of her life in prison. Where was the good in any of that? Luggs, sensing his master's mood, placed a heavy paw on Hamish's leg and whined softly. Aye, boy, Hamish said, scratching behind the dog's enormous ears. Sometimes justice feels an awful lot like tragedy. Back in Loch-Dubh, the village was preparing for Hogmanay, the last celebration of the year. The Christmas decorations were coming down, replaced by preparations for first footing and the traditional welcoming of the new year. Life, as it always did, moved forward. But the Ceilidh would be remembered, not for the music or the dancing or the festive atmosphere, but for the moment when merriment turned to murder, and for the helpful volunteer who'd smiled while serving poison. The Highlands, Hamish reflected, remembered everything, and some memories, no matter how much you might wish otherwise, could never be forgotten. Chapter 10. A quiet end to the festivities. The trial, when it came in late January, was as brief as Elaine Fraser had predicted. She pleaded guilty to murder, stood in the dock with calm dignity while the prosecutor outlined her crime, and showed no emotion when the judge sentenced her to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 18 years. Hamish attended, sitting in the public gallery alongside a handful of journalists and the curious. He watched as Elaine was led away, her back straight, her face composed. She didn't look at the gallery, didn't search for familiar faces. She simply walked through the door and disappeared from view, as neatly as she'd appeared in Loch-Dubh 6 months earlier. The journalists pounced on him afterward, wanting quotes about the Christmas silly killer, as the tabloids had dubbed her. Hamish gave them nothing beyond confirmation of the facts and escaped to his Land Rover, where Luggs waited with the patient forbearance of a saint. "Homeboy," he said, and Luggs's tail thumped agreement. Loch-Dubh had changed in subtle ways since the murder. The village hall stood empty more often than not, as if people were reluctant to gather in the space where death had intruded on celebration. Mrs. Wellington had organised a blessing ceremony, which the minister had performed with appropriate solemnity, but the shadow lingered. The Curry twins reported that attendance at village events had dropped noticeably. People were warier now, less trusting. The easy camaraderie that had characterised Loch-Dubh's social life had acquired a cautious edge. "It's the knowing," Nessie explained to Hamish one morning in the general store. "Knowing that someone could smile and serve tea while planning murder." "While planning murder," Jessie agreed darkly. "She didn't plan to murder anyone but McKinnon," Hamish pointed out, though he knew this distinction would make little difference. "But she lived among us, Hamish. Baked bread, painted pictures, volunteered at the church, and all the while she was a killer." It was useless to argue. The village needed time to process what had happened, to reconcile the helpful Ailey with the calculating Elaine. That reconciliation might take years, or it might never come at all. February brought snow again, deep and pure, covering the village in fresh white innocence. Hamish walked his beat with lugs, checking on the elderly, making sure pipes hadn't frozen, performing the small acts of service that defined his role in Lochdur. He found Angela Brodie at the doctor's surgery, organising files with the determined efficiency of someone avoiding something else. "Terrible business about Elaine Fraser," she said without preamble. "I can't stop thinking about it." "Nor can I." "Do you think she's right? That McKinnon deserved what he got?" It was the question Hamish had been asking himself for weeks. "I think McKinnon was a cruel man who destroyed lives for profit. I think Gordon Fraser deserved better than what happened to him. But I also think murder is never the answer, no matter how justified it might feel." "The law failed Gordon Fraser." "Aye, it did. But Elaine Fraser becoming a murderer doesn't fix that failure. It just creates more victims." Angela studied him with the penetrating gaze she usually reserved for difficult diagnoses. "You're more troubled by this than usual." "Am I?" "You are. I've seen you solve murders before. You're always thoughtful afterward, but this one's different. Why?" Hamish considered the question. "Because I understand her. Not agree with her, but understand. She loved her brother. McKinnon destroyed him. The law offered no real justice. I can follow the logic, even if the conclusion is wrong." "That's what makes you good at your job," Angela said gently. "You see people as people, not just as criminals or victims. But it also makes it harder on you." She wasn't wrong. Hamish had spent his career in Lochdur, walking a line between law and humanity, understanding that rigid enforcement of rules could sometimes cause more harm than good. But murder was different. Murder crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. March arrived with the first hints of spring, snowdrops pushing through the last of the snow, lambs appearing in Morven MacLeod's fields. The village began to thaw along with the landscape, people venturing out more, resuming old patterns. Mrs. Wellington organised a spring silique, Basuta defiantly announcing that they wouldn't let one tragedy define their traditions. The attendance was sparse at first, people arriving with visible reluctance, but the music worked its magic as music always did. By the end of the evening, there was almost the same warmth there had been before. Almost, but not quite. Hamish stood at the back of the hall watching the dancers and remembering another Cayley, another night when music had filled this space. He thought about Elaine Fraser sitting in her prison cell, about whether she ever regretted her choices, or whether she still believed justice had been served. The trial had revealed more details about Gordon Fraser's life. He'd been a good man by all accounts, honest in business, devoted to his family, trusting to a fault. McKinnon had exploited that trust, then crushed him when Gordon fought back. The humiliation in court had been deliberate, calculated to destroy Gordon's credibility and spirit. It had worked. 6 weeks later, Gordon Fraser had taken his own life, leaving behind a note that spoke of shame and failure. His sister Elaine had found him, had called the ambulance, knowing it was already too late, had held his hand as the paramedics confirmed what she already knew. Understanding the depth of that trauma didn't excuse murder, but it explained it in ways that made Hamish's heart ache. "Penny for them," a voice said beside him. Mary Graham had appeared, off duty and nursing a glass of wine. "Just thinking about the case. Still bothering you?" "A bit. Blair's claiming it as a great success for Strathbane CID. Says your investigation was adequate, but needed experienced oversight to bring it home." Hamish smiled despite himself. "Of course he does. For what it's worth, you did good work. Thorough, careful, methodical. You gave her every chance to confess, and when she did, you treated her with respect. She's still in prison for life. Because she committed murder. That's not on you, Hamish." Mary took a sip of wine. "You know what I think? I think Elaine Fraser wanted to be caught. All that cooperation, all that helpfulness, even after the murder. She could have run, could have disappeared, but she stayed, kept playing the role, waiting for someone smart enough to see through it. Why would she want to be caught? Because living with what she'd done was harder than she expected. Because revenge doesn't actually heal grief. Because somewhere deep down, she knew it was wrong," and Mary shrugged. "We'll never know for sure. but I think part of her was relieved when you figured it out. It was possible. Hamish remembered the look on Elaine's face when he had called her by her real name, the way she'd seemed to deflate and harden simultaneously. Relief and resignation in equal measure. As the Saley wound down and people began to leave, calling cheerful goodnights to each other, Hamish thought about the nature of memory and tradition. The village would remember this Christmas, remember the death that had interrupted their celebration, but they would also move forward, because that's what villages did. They endured. Walking home through the clear March night, Lugs trotting beside him, Hamish looked up at the stars scattered across the Highland sky like thrown diamonds. The same stars that had watched over Loch Dubh for millennia, that would continue to watch long after everyone involved in this case was dust. The Highlands remembered everything, it was true. But they also understood that life continued, seasons turned, and even tragedy eventually faded into story. The Christmas Dealie would become part of Loch Dubh's history, told and retold, embellished and analysed, until the real events were buried under layers of folklore. But Hamish would remember the truth. He would remember Elaine Fraser's grey eyes and steady hands, her watercolours and her bread-making, her careful planning and her cold execution. He would remember that she'd loved her brother enough to destroy herself avenging him. It wasn't a happy story, but it was a human one. Back at the police station, Hamish made himself a cup of tea and settled into his chair, Lugs curling up at his feet. Tomorrow there would be other problems, other crimes, other challenges, but tonight there was just peace and quiet and the gentle snoring of a dog who believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that the world was essentially good. Hamish raised his cup in a silent toast to Elaine Fraser wherever she was, to Gordon Fraser, whose trust had been betrayed, to Alistair McKinnon, who'd died as he lived, the centre of unwanted attention, and to Loch Dubh, which would endure as it always had, one scandal at a time. Outside, the wind stirred through the village, carrying with it the promise of spring and the memory of winter. The Christmas Celia was over, fading now into the past where it belonged. But the music, Hamish thought, the music would always remain. That was the thing about tradition. It outlasted tragedy, survived sorrow, and continued playing long after the dancers had gone home. And in the Highlands, where memory ran deep and forgiveness came slow, that was perhaps the greatest comfort of all. The end.